Okay, perfect. So this document is called How to Gain Clarity of a Prospect Situation in a Sales Call. And this is like evergreen. So this doesn't matter what kind of agency you run. You could be running literally any service in the world. It could be social media management. It could be paid ads. It could be consulting. It could be coaching, anything. And this will always apply. So I basically started off by saying that consulting is extremely important when you're in a sales call, because when you consult a prospect, that's when they actually respect you and they're like, okay, this person is an expert. And then from there, when you start asking them more in-depth questions, they're going to be much more likely to actually answer your questions. Because in the beginning stages, depending on who you're talking to, the prospect might be a bit more apprehensive depending on their personality archetype. So I was essentially saying that the primary method of bridging this gap will always involve consulting, because it will showcase your expertise to prove to the prospect that you're a person worthy of solving their problem. Right. So you'll see that as long as you follow the correct framework, even the most sophisticated buyer archetype will cave in and provide you with detailed answers to your questions. So the first thing that you should always do whenever you jump on a sales call is you should figure out their main inefficiencies. Right. That's like that's the number one thing they should do. Like that's the whole reason you're on the call in the first place. Right. And so in the beginning stages, what you should do is you should figure out what their past month has looked like. So first you should figure out, okay, what the past 3 months have looked like, and then specifically what the past month has looked like in terms of what they've been doing. And then from there, you should be phrasing your questions in a way in which you can figure out what their problems are. Okay, because we want to receive as much information as possible in the initial diagnosis stage before we can consult them, right? And this can only happen if their answers are expansive. And this is very important as well, because a huge mistake that people make is like, they'll ask a question, the person's going to be like, yes, no, or they're not going to give enough detail, but it's very, very easy to probe further. Like you can be like, can you elaborate on X? Why is this? Can you iterate on this a bit more? Right? Because you need as much information as possible. Because like if you're asking somebody questions and then they're giving you yes or no answers, or they're being very, very apprehensive, how will you ever consult them? Or how will you ever be an expert if you just don't have the data? Right. But at the same time, you don't want to like act like it's an interrogation. So there's like a way around it. So you want to be very careful with how you phrase your questions, right? Number two is you want to also ask them their ideal solution. I never see anybody do this, and I never used to do this either. And when I started doing this, it was a game changer, because if you ask a prospect what their ideal solution is as well, it's going to give you tons of context in terms of how to provide your solution. Right. So most people know what they're doing wrong, but they're just not going to do the right things. Or sometimes they don't know what they're doing wrong, but usually everybody has like an ideal solution. So for example, right, I'll come up with something like, like let's just say you're working with a prospect and like Tyson, for example, for you, right? Let's just say you're working with a prospect and they're only generating like, 5 appointments a month, but they're really good at sales. So they have like a 60% closing rate, right? So their ideal solution would probably be like, okay, dude, if I can get like 30 appointments a month, I'd be good. I'd be making a lot of money. Right. But once you get them to admit it, then you know for a fact that like you can use that as an emotional selling point at the end, right? Where you can be like, okay, like we both know that you need more appointments. So if you don't have an acquisition system in place, like you're done. Right. And then you can probe further on that. But if you just state it inherently yourself, but you don't get them to admit that, it's not going to be as powerful, if that makes sense. Step number 3 is you want to figure out if they have put in an active effort in solving their problem. This is also very, very important as well. And the reason this is important is because, so I'll use that same context beforehand, right? So if you ask your prospect and he's like, yeah, you're like, I'm only booking in 5 appointments a month, but then you didn't ask him like if he's tried to fix this problem, you're not going to have as much leverage. But if he tells you like, dude, I tried this, I tried ads, it just didn't work, then you can also use that at the end and be like, listen, you've already tried the solution before. So if you don't buy from myself or from somebody else, what are you going to do? Right. And people tend to not want to ask these questions because they think it's being a bit too intrusive, but in reality, it's really not. You're just trying to figure out like, what have they done? Has it worked for them? Right. You're just problem solving. Like you're being a doctor. It's like when you go to the doctor, they're asking you like, have you tried this medicine? Are you allergic to this? How has this been? Right. They're just asking you questions. Very, very important. And number 4 is you want them to expand on their inefficiencies and verbally articulate how they're prohibiting their desired outcome. If you can get them to do this, like you're golden. This is like when you get them to verbally admit that their process isn't working. And this will only happen if you've done the first 3 steps correctly, because if you haven't done that, then they're not going to admit what they're doing is wrong, because sometimes people might come in with an ego, but like, if you come in and then you problem solve, you show them you're an expert, you talk about your solution in depth, then they'll be like, okay, like this person's right, like I'm probably messing up big time. And then they'll admit what they're doing wrong. Right. So if done right at this stage, the prospect will already see you as an expert and will be more than willing to expand further on the previous inefficiencies. You want to be very careful in the way you phrase your questions here, because you don't want to sound too salesy. The goal here is to get them on the same page as yourself before you begin your pitch. Right. So at this point in time, right after the 4 steps, essentially before you actually dive into the pitch, you both know what their inefficiencies are. They've admitted what their inefficiencies are, and they've admitted that they need the missing piece, which is what you're going to be selling. So if you guys are trying to sell them an acquisition system, then get them to admit that like they need an acquisition system, right? So for example, with you, Jennifer, you sell social media management. So for you, your job would be to get them to admit that, okay, like if I don't have somebody correctly managing my pages, I'm going to lose out on clients. And one client to me is worth X. So for example, you work with surgeon clinics. So to them, one client is worth, multiple 4 or 5 figures, right? So to them, it can be like, okay, like I'm losing out on that much if I don't fix this problem. Right. Then when you get them to admit that at the end, when you pitch your price, which is 2.5K, I mean, they'll pay it. Like they'd be absurd not to, right? Because they have already admitted it themselves. And also check this out. Once you get them to admit it at the end, if they're like fighting back the price, you can be like, hey, but Jeff, didn't you just say that this is what it's worth to you? Right. You know what I mean? So you can use it as leverage. But if you just say it to them the entire time, then like it doesn't really matter as much. But if they admit it themselves, then you're good. Now, in terms of figuring out their main inefficiencies, I have an example for e-commerce, and I have an example if you're running a coaching or consulting business. So if you're running an e-commerce agency, you need to figure out what the prospect's past experience was like with their prior agency, right? So if they're on a call with you, like figure out like why they're not currently working with an agency. Because if you guys run an agency and you're working with a client, they most likely are agency list. So you have to figure out like, why is that the case? Instead of just asking them, like, oh, what's your revenue? What's your desired income? Like figure out why they're in their current state, right? That's very, very important. Right, and then figure out, was communication an issue with their prior agency? Maybe the creatives were terrible, like maybe they weren't converting. Like your job is to pinpoint the problem and bring it to their attention instantly. Okay. And in terms of consequences, you also want to make sure that you're iterating the consequences of them not solving said problems, right? And it's even better if you can formulate your questions in a manner that gets the prospect to admit the consequences of not solving the problem. So as you guys can see, this is a very common theme. It's like you're consulting, you're saying a little bit of like what the consequences would be, but the end goal should be to formulate the questions in a way in which they themselves are also admitting what the consequences are, right? And that's like where you're combining being a consultant and being a therapist at the same time. It's really, really hard to do. And if you guys mess it up, like you don't want to ask stupid questions, right? But there's a way around it, and you guys will get better as time goes on. But always ask yourself, okay, how can I ask this person a question for them to come to that conclusion that I want them to come to? Right? Now, if you're running a coaching or consulting business, you guys need to figure out key pieces of information such as, right, and Caleb and Tyson, this is very, very important. Okay, so number of appointments the prospect is booking in every month. Okay, number of appointments that are qualified, their closing rate. Right, when you guys ask information like this in terms of this sequence, it makes their situation appear to be that much more, I guess you can say like grotesque, like they're fucked. Because if somebody says like, okay, I'm booking in 10 appointments a month, they might be like, oh, 10 appointments a month. But then if you're like, okay, cool, 10 appointments a month, how much of them are qualified? 50%. How much are you closing? 20%. Nice. So you're getting like one potential close a month. They're like, fuck. Right. Whereas if you're just like, oh, okay, like 10 appointments, nice. You see, like if you narrow it down as much as possible, because the prospect themselves might not even know what their situation actually is, because people don't realize it. Like they're on the call with you because they need help, right? But if you can like actually like bring out their actual inefficiencies, they're gonna pay you every single time. Like some people might be getting 50 appointments a month, but those 50 appointments might be trash, right? It might be like 20% are qualified. Their show up rate is like 50%, and then their closing rate is 15%. And it's like, okay, nice. I don't even know what that comes out to, but like probably 3 closes in a month, right? So if you can actually bring out the actual situation on a call, you're good. And this is why you should not be afraid to probe as much as humanly possible. Also, you should figure out how is the founder allocating their time in the business. Like this is very, very important as well, right? Figure that out, right? The reason this is very important is because, as the founder, right, they probably want to be in a certain position in which they're just managing their team. Now, they most likely are micromanaging, right? That's something that a lot of people do when they're in the trenches, right? So you want to, state that, listen, if you guys are micromanaging, you're just not gonna be able to grow the business. You should state what the most important factors are. So I tell, like, whenever I sell to coaches or consultants, I'm like, listen, like, until you guys are at 50K a month, you should be taking sales calls and creating content and just managing your team and not micromanaging your team. There's a difference, right? And then I'll explain what the difference actually is. And what's funny is, like, when I say it like that in a very logical tone, they're like, and they're probably micromanaging, they're like, shit, this guy's right. Like, what am I doing? So figure that out. Also figure out how many appointments are coming in from outbound, inbound, and referrals. This is extremely important. Like, Caleb, like figure this out as well, right? Like, because if somebody is getting tons of appointments coming in from well, not tons, but if they're getting if it's like an equal distribution of inbound, referrals, and outbound, then you can tell them, like, look, your outbound efforts are not enough, and we can't really control referrals because that's randomized, and inbound as well is going to be dependent on your personal brand, which is going to be a slow burner effect. So as time goes on, you'll be getting more inbound leads. That means that the only way we can increase revenue is by directly altering outbound. right? And then you can also ask them a really good question, like to ask them is like, okay, if you did not focus on outbound and you stuck to inbound referrals, where do you think revenue would be in the next 6 months, right? And then they'll always admit like, oh, I'd probably add like only 3-4K, and now you're good, right? You just got them to admit it. Now you have leverage. Now you know that outbound is the focus, right? And you sell appointments that are so like, if anything, this is like perfect for you. Like literally always use a structure. Like this is fucking ideal for your service, by the way. And Tyson, you can use something very, very similar to this as well, like because you sell a similar service where you provide appointment setting from LinkedIn, right? And then also figure out how much are they involved in the booking process, right? Because and again, like if you have appointment setters, figure this out too, right? Like ask them, like, by the way, like you're booking in appointments, how involved are you? Because sometimes what happens, by the way, from what I've seen, is some people have setters, but their setters are so trash that they themselves like take over half the time, and then it's like, okay, why do you even have setters in the first place? Right. So figure that part out as well, so you can sell them emotionally from there. Now, if you're able to follow the steps stated above, you will have created significantly more leverage for yourself for the rest of the call. And like you're basically good at this point. At this point, like if you have access to all this information, once you actually go into the pitch, that's where you can start bringing in this personal information into your pitch. Right? Because what most people do wrong is like they'll go into the pitch and then they don't like connect any of the personal information that the prospect gave them. And then from there, it just appears to be like an evergreen presentation, whereas it should always appear to be more personalized. The more personalized a presentation, the more leverage you have, and the larger the possibility of actually getting a close, as long as they obviously have the budget. Now, in terms of asking them what their ideal solution is, so what I basically am doing here is I'm going to be expanding on the 4 steps. So in terms of asking them what their ideal solution is, if you guys are running an e-commerce agency, you need to figure out what the prospect's ideal agency will look like in terms of performance and communication, right? So for an e-commerce founder, they always have 2 goals. Number one is like they always want to hit certain benchmarks in terms of revenue, but they also want to make sure that their agency is communicating them consistently. So you should figure out what that looks like, because most of the reason that agencies, e-commerce businesses actually fire agencies is because communication is always a factor. Where like they're not very responsive, and they're not able to go ahead and get information across in a rapid time frame. So you should like iterate on like what that would look like as well. So then like if they say that, hey, communication to us is very important, then you can dive into the fact that like, okay, yeah, you told me before that your last agency was lacking communication. I can see that being a huge issue for us. Communication is always a priority. You can just expand on that. Right. And then they're going to not only buy into the fact that you can get them really good results, but they can buy into the fact that, okay, like the next 3 months of working with this person is going to look really good for us. Like he's going to always be there. He's going to always answer us. Right. And that's what they actually care about. And Chris did a really good job at this, Brandon, when he did his call when I was reviewing it last time. Now, if you're running a coaching consulting business, you need to figure out what they want to achieve in the next 6 months of their business, right? This can not only be a revenue goal, but also an infrastructure goal, right? So one more thing as well is like when you start asking people what their goals are for the next 6 months, don't ask them like, hey, what's a figure you want to hit in the next 6 months? Just ask them, hey, what would the next 6 months look like for you in an ideal situation? Because at that point, they're not going to be biased, and they're not going to just talk about revenue. They'll talk about everything. If it's something emotional, they'll mention something emotional, right? So whatever it is, they're going to mention it. And again, you have more leverage now. Now, for example, they might be micromanaging their entire business and they want to only hit a certain benchmark revenue-wise, but it may also want to be removed from the grunt work, right? So that might also be something, right? So figure out what their summer vacation is, right? This is very, very important. And then probe as much as you possibly can. And it is imperative for you to figure out their why. If you don't know their why, it's never going to work out, right? And this is for me what led me from like a 35-40 to 50% closing rate is when I started like bringing a bit more emotion into it, because I was always overly logical on calls, and like I didn't care what their why was, because I'm like, okay, like they're on the call because they have an inefficiency. And then after that, I was like, okay, like it's probably like important for me to figure out like why they're on the call, so I can figure out like why they've been sticking with their business even though they've been failing for the past 6 months. It's probably really important to them, right? And then you can use that as leverage when you're negotiating price if there's a lot of pushback. Because like one thing that I need you guys to understand is like, if logic is all it took for people to buy, then why would we even have a sales call with them, right? We wouldn't have to ever be in the call, because if humans were good at making decisions, they would just be like, okay, like obviously this is going to help me scale my business. Okay, here's $6,000, here's 10 grand, here's 15 grand, right? But that's never the case. And this is why, like, us as salespeople, we have to be the people that are guiding them in terms of making that correct decision. All right, so very important to figure out their why, and that also their summer vacation, which is the same thing essentially. Now, figure out if they have put in an active effort in solving their problem. So I'll talk about what both situations will look like. So if you guys are running an e-commerce agency, right, you may have already gotten this answer from figuring out the inefficiencies because it would have included poor results from their prior agency. So in terms of like what they've done, like in an active effort for an e-commerce business, like they themselves, like the only thing they can really do is just hire other agencies. Like, I mean, they're an e-commerce business. It's not like they themselves are going to be doing the groundwork. So like for them, you would have already gotten this answer prior. So there's like no reason to ask this question specifically. Now, if you guys are running a coaching or consulting business, or you can ask the prospect what they have tried to do in solving their problem, right? So maybe they bought courses in consulting in the past, but it did not work. So figure out like who they bought from, why it did not work, what the issue was, right? This is very, very important because if they bought from someone and you guys are both providing the exact same product and you don't know this prior to the call, and then you go in blindsided and you're thinking like, okay, like this person's gonna buy from me, and then like they never tell you, like you're screwed. But whereas if you figure out that they bought from someone who's very similar to you, then you can figure out what the issue was, and the issue might have been them the whole time. Maybe they did not put enough time into it, and you can bring that factor to light, and then they'll buy from you, right? But if you don't figure out what the results look like in the past, then people don't want to repeat the same mistake again, right? So figure that out as well. Now, it is also possible that prior to your call with them, they had no knowledge of their problem. This is also pretty common. So sometimes people will book in calls with you just out of curiosity and they'll still buy. We've had countless customers that had no intention of buying when they booked in a call with us. And then like I iterated what the consequences would be of them not moving forward, or what their situation would look like for the next 3 to 6 months if they did not move forward, or if they did not solve their problem. And then from there, they actually ended up buying. So it's usually like, I'd probably say like 80-20, like 80% of people when they book in a call, obviously they have a problem, but sometimes there's people that like they're not even aware they have a problem. They're just booking because of curiosity, right? So it's your job to figure out what their problem is and bring that to light as well. Now, if that is the case, then simply conclude the problem and get them to admit the importance of solving it and jump into your pitch. Now, in terms of some powerful questions to ask, so I also like explained this before, like in terms of constantly probing and getting them to expand. So expansive questions is like, what inspired you to get on this call today? How's your time currently being divided up within your business? What is your ideal solution? To what extent do you feel you have good service market fit? This is really good if you have not e-commerce, because obviously if it's e-commerce, like duh, like run an e-commerce business. But if you guys are offering like coaching or consulting, then you can ask them to like, what extent do they have good service market fit? So for example, for you, Tyson, if somebody is like a coach and let's just say like, they're providing like, I don't know, sales coaching, for example, right? I'm just coming up with something random on the spot, right? You can ask them like, to what extent do they feel that they have good service market fit? Because if their offer sucks, then like you can probably help them like, build out a better offer on the call itself. And like, what I mean by that is like, if you yourself think that their offer isn't up to par, then you can like work on that a little bit as well. And then they can understand that, okay, like this person is helping me out with my offer as well. And then they're also gonna be helping me out with booking more appointments. You can like also consult a little bit as well, even though that might not be expertise. If you feel like, that is an issue, then you can bring that to light as well. Why do you want to scale to desired number? This is very, very important. So if somebody says they want to get to like 50K or 30K or 20K, like ask them why. Like don't just say okay, because everybody has a why, right? This is a very easy way to figure out their why. So I explained before, like, try to figure out the prospect's why. So if you ask them, like, if you just ask them why, it's a way to figure out their why. Where most people think like, I don't want to do that because it's a stupid question, but it's not. You're trying to figure out more information. How urgent is X? This is also really, really good, right? So and this would depend on the type of question you're asking, but figuring out urgency is also very, very important, because if the prospect, states that it's very urgent for them to fix a specific problem, and at the end they're like, I want to think about it, or like, oh, now's not a good time, then we can bring this out and like, didn't you just state that this was very urgent? So what's really going on, man? Right? And then from there, they're gonna start admitting, like they lied to you. Sometimes that happens. They're like, oh, you got me, right? And then you're good. And also, can you elaborate on X? This should be like your secret weapon. Can you elaborate on X? Because most people, by the way, like when they jump on calls, they're just not going to talk. Most people are not talkers. Like, a few people are, but most people aren't, at least from my experience, from the type of people that I deal with, most people are not talkers. Right? Tyson, you were not a talker. Right? And when I've bought from people, I'm not a talker either, right? I'm pretty like reserved on calls. And Brandon too, you were not a talker at all, dude. Like you not fucking say a word. And then I had to get you guys to talk, right? And so most people are going to be like that. So it's very, very important for them to elaborate. Like if I just like took your guys' answers, you guys would have never bought, because I would have like never known what the actual issue here was, right? Because I would have never gotten you guys to elaborate. So like always get the prospect to elaborate every single time. And then from there, like they'll just keep talking, because people are not going to talk unless they have a reason to, especially people like us, right? People who are much more quiet, introverted, more reserved. Like we will only talk if there's a reason to, right? So, get people to do that, right? And especially if you guys are introverted yourselves, like that's better. You know what makes you talk, right? And that's when like people are asking you relevant questions. So ask relevant questions. Very, very important. And if you guys can pull this off, and again, I'll be posting this document on Loom, and I'll be like also, making a the Loom video, like describing all this. It'll be on Notion. You'll be good to go. Like if you guys can follow the script, like you'll be golden. Like this is the exact same like structure that I've used to close almost $1 million at this point in sales, and it works really, really well. Right? I'll be adding on more to it as well over time. but you guys want to make sure that you have a structure in place every single time. So it's like figure out their inefficiencies, ask them their ideal solution, figure out if they have put any in an active effort, and then get them to articulate what the consequences can be. Right. And this, by the way, step 4 is only possible if you nail step 1, 2, and 3, because you can't just like not build. And people think, okay, one more thing I wanted to mention. People think building rapport is like getting the prospect to like you. That's not building rapport. Building rapport is like when you're solving their problems and then the guy's like, okay, like this guy knows what he's doing. That's when you build rapport, because then they have your respect and then you can ask them whatever you want. That's building rapport.